Praise be Jesus and Mary. Today we begin this beautiful season of Advent. The word Advent literally means coming. And so the first part of Advent, we reflect and meditate on Jesus' second coming. And then halfway through, we transition to reflecting and meditating on Jesus' first coming, when he was born of the Virgin Mary. What do both of these comings of the Lord have in common? They remind us of God's fidelity. And they remind us, as St. Paul so beautifully says in his letter to the Romans, that there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that can separate us from the love of God. These two truths, God's fidelity and God's love, shine so powerfully today through the scriptures. In the first reading from the prophet Jeremiah, it's important to know at least the historical context of this passage. Because during this time here in chapter 31, Israel is in exile. She is enslaved in Babylon. And in many ways, I'm sure, at least in the psyche of Israel, the promises of God, the memories of the promised land, appear now as something in the past, as something that once happened, that is something that is no longer present for Israel. And yet it is in this context where the Lord today proclaims through the prophet this messianic prophecy. I will raise up for David a just shoot. And in those days, Judah shall be safe and secure. God is reminding Israel of his fidelity and of his love. In the second reading from 1 Thessalonians, Paul writes this letter primarily as a pastoral letter because he is deeply concerned about the new converts in that area whose faith is being threatened by persecution and by paganism. And Paul is not able to travel there to see them face to face. And so he writes this letter, 1 Thessalonians, as a pastoral letter meant to encourage them. And today we hear him say things like, abound in love for one another. Be blameless in holiness. Why? He's reminding them of God's fidelity and of God's love. In the gospel today, Jesus talks about the whole natural world collapsing as we know it. And it's almost surprising, but Jesus said, what does Jesus say today in the gospel? He says, when you see these things happening, he doesn't say to run and to hide. He says, stand erect and raise your heads, because your redemption is at hand. Why do we not have to be afraid when we see these events occurring? Because God is faithful. and God is love. Israel's infidelity doesn't keep God away. The Thessalonians' immaturity and fear doesn't keep God away. Even the natural world falling apart as we know it doesn't keep God away. God's light is always breaking in to our darkness. God's light is always breaking into our doubts and to our fear, and reminding us that He is faithful and that nothing can separate us from His love. What then does Advent invite us to? It invites us to, I believe, a deeper interior silence, a deeper interior stillness, not as an end in itself, but as a way to turn us more fully towards the light that is breaking into our lives each moment, attempting to brighten our very being with the presence of Christ. My friends, this season is a season of light. And despite any attempts, either by ourselves or by the world, this light cannot be extinguished. As St. John says so powerfully in his prologue, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. As we begin this Advent season, let us ask Our Lady today, she who was the first to welcome the light of Christ into her life, she whose very presence reminds us of God's fidelity and love. Let us ask her to quiet us down, so that we can once again welcome our salvation in the presence of her Son.